Today in the Chicana kitchen, we're making pumpkin empanadas, or empanadas de calabaza. This traditional Mexican treat is sometimes served during observations of El Día de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, but it would be equally at home at any fall celebration, even as an alternative to pumpkin pie on your Thanksgiving table. So, let's get baking. We'll start by making our pumpkin filling. You can use either canned pureed pumpkin, in which case you'll want to use 2 cans of pumpkin, 2 15-ounce cans, or you can use a whole pumpkin, and in that case you want to start ideally with a pumpkin that weighs about 2.5 pounds, because by the time we peel and seed that, we'll wind up with 2 pounds of pumpkin. If you get a pumpkin that's a little bit smaller or larger, of course, just adjust the amounts of the rest of the ingredients. And another note about fresh pumpkin, look for a pie pumpkin. That's usually how they're sold in markets in the US anyway. And those are the ones that are, again, a little bit smaller. They're not as good for carving jack-o'-lanterns, but they're much better for eating than the big jack-o'-lantern pumpkins. All right, I'm going to get this peeled and chopped. And now I have my pumpkin pieces in a saucepan. To that, we will add about 1/2 cup of water, some cinnamon sticks. You can use 2 or 3 cinnamon sticks. You could use ground cinnamon instead. A few pieces of star anise. I happen to have this on hand. You could definitely use ground anise. I've got a range of measurements in the recipe below. Anise is a very traditional flavor in a lot of Mexican pastries, especially things that involve pumpkin, and it's a flavor that is traditional in the fall and with a lot of other pastries and dishes that we associate with Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. So I definitely put the anise in here. It is not everybody's favorite flavor, so you can go with a smaller amount or omit it entirely. Speaking of strong tastes, we're going to put a bit of ground clove. I do have whole cloves, but I don't want to try and fish those out. The cinnamon stick and the anise are bigger and easier to find later. But the cloves can really surprise you and you can lose track of them. One more thing, speaking of traditional flavors, we're going to use panela. It's also known as piloncillo. It is an unrefined brown sugar. You could definitely use regular brown sugar in an equal amount. So for this quantity, we'll use about 5 ounces of panela. And I just have this, it's very hard. I just have this in chunks. This is sold usually in discs or a cone shape. And I just got a few big chunks. And we are going to set this pot on medium heat and just let the pumpkin and the panela and all of the flavors simmer and melt. The pumpkin's going to soften. If you are using canned pumpkin puree, you're going to put everything in the pot just the same way. You just won't need as much cooking time as we do for the fresh pumpkin. All right, so we'll let this simmer for about 20 minutes or so, and then check in with it and go from there. It's probably going to need altogether about 40 minutes of cook time for the pumpkin to break all the way down and become kind of jammy. And while that is happening, we will start making our empanada dough. The pumpkin filling is simmering away, which makes the kitchen smell fantastic. So it is time to pull together our empanada dough. For this, we need 3 cups of regular all-purpose flour. That's about 375 grams. To that, we will add, since it's a sweet dough, we'll add sugar. I'm going to add a scant 1/4 cup of sugar. The filling is fairly sweet, so I'm not going to go sweeter than that. We can always sprinkle the tops of the empanadas with sand and sugar if we want. A healthy pinch of kosher salt, maybe 1 more for good luck. And we are going to, I'm using a food processor here, pretty obviously. We are going to give that just a quick pulse to mix those dry ingredients together. You can definitely mix this by hand using a pastry blender or even just a big fork, okay? In any case, just give that a quick mix to distribute the sugar and the salt across the flour. When I use my food processor, I like to drape a kitchen towel over it just so that it doesn't send a little puff of flour out around my counter. So here we go. All right, and now that that salt and sugar is distributed through the flour, I'm going to add butter. I have 12 tablespoons of butter. That is a stick and a half. I've got measurement by weight in the description. All right, and that butter is cold and cut into big chunks. All right, you don't have to worry about it being ice cold, but definitely don't let that warm up to room temperature. So here goes my kitchen towel again, and I'm going to pulse this until the largest bits of butter are about the size of a pea, and the rest of it is more like coarse sand or gravel. All right, and if you're using a pastry blender, same thing, just work that with the pastry blender or the fork or what have you until you have a few little larger pebbles of butter mixed in with the flour. All right, my butter is worked in. I'm just taking a spatula and making sure that there aren't any big clumps of butter hiding in here. Looks all right. So we will add one last thing, which is two last things, pardon me. We're going to add milk, about 1/3 of a cup of milk. Again, if it's cold, great. You don't need to let it get warm, that's for sure. And 1 egg. This will use another egg as well, but that will be for the egg wash that we use to seal the empanadas and then to brush the tops before we bake them. All right, so 1 egg in. And most of our milk, I will reserve just a little bit of it. We want to go low on the liquid if we can, and add just a little bit more as we need. All right. We will pulse this until it starts to hold together into a, almost into a cohesive dough, but still a little bit crumbly. All right, so you can kind of see that this dough is starting to hold together. We're going to, using the food processor, blah, blah, blah. Using the food processor, we're going to hold that, that button down for just a little bit longer this time, just so that it starts to pull together into one ball of dough. If you are doing this in a bowl, you will have abandoned your pastry blender at this point, and you're going to get your hands in there. We will need this with the hands one way or another anyhow. One more go here. All right, so that's what my dough looks like now. I'm going to slide this out of the way, get just a bit of flour on my counter, and I'm going to turn this dough out onto the counter and just work that over with my hands for a few strokes, not a whole lot. All right, so if you are using a food processor, a little trick, hold the blade from underneath with a finger so that it doesn't fall out with your dough, and then you can just scrape the extra little stuff bits off from there. All right, set that aside. Pull that together. And the reason we don't want to let this come all the way together in the food processor is that that will wind up breaking those little pebbles of butter into smaller and smaller pieces. And the reason we want those little bits of butter kind of intact and encased in the flour mixture is that that's what allows our dough to be flaky. So we only really want to work it enough to have it hold together, and that is enough. And if we let that all happen in the food processor, no, we don't get our hands so dirty, but our dough is a little overworked, and it will still taste fine, but the texture will be nice and flaky this way. All right, so I have one mass of dough, and I'm just gonna leave that all in one chunk and cover it for at least 20 to 30 minutes, and that just lets the dough relax, lets the gluten develop in that dough, which makes it stretchier, easier to roll out into thin rounds for our empanadas, and those won't tear or break as easily while still being a little bit flaky. All right, if you are going to make your empanadas really soon, you don't even have to refrigerate this dough. You can just let it sit covered so that it doesn't dry out again for at least 20 or 30 minutes. If you are going to wait a little while before you form your empanadas, go ahead and wrap this and refrigerate it for up to 2 or 3 days, and it will be just fine. You could freeze it. I usually don't, but you definitely could freeze this ahead as well. All right, so we'll come back to this when we are ready to form our empanadas, but in the meantime, we're gonna go back and check on our pumpkin filling. Our pumpkin filling has been simmering away, most of that time covered, for about 40 minutes. I removed the cinnamon stick and the star anise about 10 minutes ago and let it just keep cooking. And as you can see, that pumpkin has really broken down. I didn't mash it or anything, just a little bit of stirring here and there, and the time in the pot allowed those chunks of pumpkin to turn into this lovely filling. Now, if you're using whole pumpkin, it will not get quite as smooth as if you use pureed pumpkin. So if you want a super smooth texture, you could definitely pop this into a blender and smooth that out a little bit. Otherwise, it is ready to use as soon as it chills. We don't want to put hot filling in our empanada dough because that will melt those little pockets of butter that we're counting on to make the dough flaky. So do let this chill, but otherwise it is ready to use. Or if you want to wait a little bit, you can definitely leave this in the refrigerator for a couple of days and form your empanadas when you're ready. I am ready to bake off some empanadas. The oven is preheated to 375 degrees. Kitchen counter is floured. I have a small rolling pin here, a baking sheet lined with a silicone mat, my egg wash, which is just 1 egg beaten with a little bit of water, and we'll use that to seal the empanadas and to brush the tops. My dough is here and my filling. And you can bake all of your empanadas at once. I'll actually be baking off a few and putting the rest of my dough and filling aside for later. A couple of words about the quantities. I'll make between 24 and 30 fairly small empanadas. You can definitely measure this out. This wound up being 700 grams of dough by weight, so you can do the math on that and work it out so that they're just perfectly equal in size. I won't be that precise about it, but it'll work out to probably 2.5 dozen altogether. And your filling, unless you have a particularly small pumpkin, you'll have more than enough filling for the empanadas. You don't want to overfill them or else they'll leak all over the place. So you could make extra empanadas or treat it like pumpkin butter. All right, so you'll have something like 2 cups or so, which definitely, again, is more than you need. So use it like pumpkin butter, spread it on toast, or stir it into yogurt, or eat it with oatmeal, something like that. All right, so let me get my dough divided And sometimes you'll see recipes that tell you to roll it out and then cut it into circles. And I feel like that winds up being more work than it needs to be because, you know, then you have scraps to re-roll and all of that. So what we're going to do here is just take our dough and divide it into pieces and roll those into a ball and then roll them out flat. All right, so let's see, we have, now that was a quarter of the dough, this is an eighth of the dough. So I suppose I could be a little bit precise about it and make pieces, about that size or so. All right, so we are going to take the first of those, just roll it into a ball. All right, and if your dough is fighting you, give it a little bit more time to rest. All right, and by fighting you, I mean if it is kind of tearing or not wanting to roll out or out very thin or spring back or something like that, like spring back into a smaller piece, by all means, just let it rest a little bit longer. Sometimes it needs to be cooler. Sometimes it needs actually to be not so cold. If you just pulled it out of the refrigerator, you might want it to get a little bit more. All right, so let's see. You can roll that pretty thin, and you'll notice I am not rolling it into a circle. It's sort of a very rough oval, and that will be just good enough for us because we're going to fold this over and wind up with kind of a half moon shape. All right, and you will notice that's going to make a pretty decent sized empanada. All right, these are not tiny. If you want teeny tiny ones, you might wind up with something like 36 or even 48. All right, this will be a not so tiny empanada. All right, plenty generous. I am going to brush about half of the edge, kind of in a rainbow shape, with some egg wash, and then add a bit of filling. You don't want to overdo it because this filling, unlike a meat filling, potato or something for a savory empanada, I mean, this is pretty loose. It's a thick puree, a thick kind of jam, if you will, but it's not that thick. So you really don't want this to run out the edges. So err on the side of a little too little filling, all right? And as you get more experience with empanadas, you can increase it from there. So I'm going to fold my edge over and just press it to give it that initial seal. And then I'm going to fold these over again. And this is why we didn't need to worry about having a nice smooth shape, because this is going to get folded over and then we're going to crimp it one more time and it'll wind up looking really pretty, but we didn't need to fuss about the shape being perfect when we rolled it out. So I'm going to just fold it back again, and you can use a fork to seal these. You can get really fancy with it and make it kind of a rope, like a twisted rope shape, which is actually what this winds up being without really too much work or effort. All right, so here is our empanada. All right, I'm going to slide that onto my little baking sheet. I'll form a few more and then we'll brush them with egg wash and slide them into the oven. Once your empanadas are all formed and on a baking tray, you can brush them with a bit more of the egg wash, and this will just give them a nice shiny, kind of more deeply golden brown top. You could take a further step and sprinkle them with coarse sugar, like demerara sugar or sanding sugar, or even cinnamon sugar if you want. I actually like leaving mine just as they are without that sprinkle of sugar. So that's what I'll be doing. And do notice they don't need a lot of space around them. They're not going to expand. We hope they won't leak either, hence the double folding of the edges, decorative and functional. All right, and they're now ready for the oven, 375 degrees for about 18 minutes. If you make considerably smaller or larger empanadas, just adjust that time up or down a bit, and we'll just be looking for them to have a nice golden brown crust. And of course your filling's already cooked, so no worries there. All right, we'll see these when they're out of the oven. Our empanadas are beautifully golden brown and they smell amazing. All that's left is to let them cool and we can take a taste. We hope you give these a try and you check back every Friday at 4 o'clock for a new recipe.